Welcome to the exploration of consciousness.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the exploration of consciousness. I'm your host, Matt Presti. I'm honored to welcome my friend Scott Hiegel to the show. Scott and I met several years back in lieu of our mutual interest in Walter Russell. Today's show is going to be about the work of Walter Russell in comparison and contrast to that of Gopi Krishna. Scott Hiegel runs an entrepreneurial consulting business called SoulQuest. He has a BBA from the University of Wisconsin and an MBA from UCLA. He is a former CPA, CFA, and vice president of corporate finance, entrepreneur, and investment banker. He enjoys writing and speaking about his experiences with Kundalini and his lifelong roller coaster and at times perilous search for inner peace. Sounds familiar. I imagine a lot of my audience has the same story. So his speaking, outreach, film, poetry, and other creative expression, his goal is to entertain and inform people about the gifts and profound importance of Gopi Krishna's work, Kundalini, higher states of consciousness, as well as aspects of Walter and Leo Russell's natural science and work. So welcome to the program, Scott. How are you doing today?
Great, Matt. Well, I'm very grateful to be here today, be able to speak with you.
Excellent. And you made a journey, several long journeys around the country by automobile. And you happened to stop by and visit me in one of those occasions. You met the Chicken family, and we had a delightful conversation and get together. And you were also, and we'll link up some links below this this interview as well. To you were on recently with Buddha at the Gas Pump. You were a guest speaker at the University of Science and Philosophy a couple years back, and so that'll all be linked up as well. And the International Consciousness Research out of Canada, we were due to go together to that and introduce and present in person, but unfortunately we know we all got sideswiped with the pandemic as it were, so we never got to make that trip. But nonetheless, I'm happy to have you on, and our topic again is going to be comparison contrast of Walter Russell and Gopi Krishna, cosmic consciousness, and things that basically revolve around those topics. So why don't you just, for the audience, give a little bit more of an introduction and maybe your earliest experience when you came to realize there was something more to life than just the ordinary consciousness with which many people walk around with.
Okay, well, again, very grateful to be here, Matt. As you were giving my introduction, you were reading my background, and I thought to myself, would I ever one day be talking about consciousness? You know, coming from such a financial background and a family where my father started at the bottom of a company and worked his way up to CEO of Oscar Mayer, and that was what I thought my life path was going to be. And you're right, I did travel cross country, stopping in Missouri to see you in the middle of Missouri, and then made it over to your museum. And was just amazed by the museum and what you guys accomplished with that and how you're highlighting Walter Russell. And so, and it's funny because the other two times I was at your place, I had driven cross country and I was really tired and kind of burnt out. It's kind of nice to be here sitting in my own little place here in La Quinta. But yeah, I grew up in Madison, Wisconsin. I'm a Midwesterner, and a family of 8 kids. So there's 10 of us. And like I said, my father, he was God the Father. He was the patriarch of our family. He was a very tough man, a very brilliant man, and he was the economic foundation of our family. And then my mother was a very kind and loving person, and there was a lot of craziness in our family. I grew up on a lake, and we played, we boated a lot in the summers. Then we went to the country club and played golf, and I was a very shy kid, again, somebody that was terrified of public speaking. That's another, surprise that I'm here doing with you today. But I started on this life journey, which was again more on the business side to get to the top. And I won't go into a lot of details of that, but my goal was to be more than my father, who became, from the mailroom of Oscar Mayer to the CEO. And so that led me into finance. I worked in investment banking for one summer at Lehman Brothers in New York City, and then I ended up at Prudential Capital, was riding up the ladder there, and was living in Marin County. I was married, and I had so much at that time. I had money. We could travel. I had a beautiful wife. Marin County, and it's just north of San Francisco. It was just a beautiful area. And yet there was something about all of that I wasn't happy. It was like I was always it seemed like I was doing things that I was supposed to be doing. Like I was kind of in this trance since childhood of, just following what I'm supposed to be. I never really understood who I was inside of me. And then what happened is everything started to go wrong. I was at that time, this is when I was about 40 years old, and I was working at 101 California Street in the middle of the financial district in San Francisco, and 43rd floor, and with a man who was at that time chairman of the board of the University of California Regents, later an ambassador to France, and he was a big investment guy, and we were finding companies for him to buy, and I got a real window into I would say with the people that came to his office, there were senators and there were CEOs, and I just got a real window into the power structures. It was real education. But
some people would call it the heart of the beast in the midst of the financial. And I'm sure that's, you're speaking too of what many people who come to a spiritual kind of lifestyle, they're all living what's expected of them is an interesting thing, trying to please the expectations of parents and of society. So I think you're right on the money with, being in the heart of this and then coming to, the clarity of a spiritual realization that, this is not the life I want to be leading.
Yeah, it was funny at that time, Matt, because it was like, this is my dream job out of business school. And here I was, I don't know, about 11, 12 years later living it and just not happy one bit. Mm-hmm. And then it kind of like, I had a chance to do a really big deal, actually buy a New York Stock Exchange company. And a couple of days later, it was supposed to close and I was going to make a lot of money and it was going to be the freedom to do whatever I wanted and own some of that company. And then it unexpectedly fell apart. That was at the end of 1994. Everything went to hell after that. It's like everything that said I was something. We had these various investments and they all start to go to zero. And I ended up getting divorced and had to sell my house. And I look back and it was the best thing that ever happened to me, even though at that time, and let me just back up. I've always been on a spiritual path because I had anxiety from a very early age. And so I was always, I went and saw a psychologist. I was always working on myself to try to get better. So I had been living a double life, actually, kind of pursuing a spiritual path and also the financial path. But when that happened, it was like I went full time into spirituality. I just knew that I was being called to something different. And yet it was hard because I had to let go of the money and had to let go of, there was a certain amount of prestige, family acceptance, society acceptance. And so,
sure. I think that's indicative of a lot of people's wake up. They got to come out of something in order to realize that there's something more to get into, you could say. But in terms of your Kundalini experience and what we'll discuss too in this, which I have to say, Scott he wrote, and I printed out 20, let me give it the page number right, 21 pages of notes. And this is cool because it's kind of the foundation topic that we're going to run along. And I'll put this actual link to this Word file as a PDF on mattpresti.com/posts when I post this interview there. That way you guys can actually pull these notes out and follow along, but it's very in depth. And so just real quick, when we get into the discussion of Kundalini and Gopi Krishna meets Walter Russell, Gopi basically came at divine illumination as a biological process that he felt was something that humanity was moving quite naturally into. In comparison, Walter Russell also felt that cosmic consciousness was man's birthright, and that it would be a new faculty, as Dr. Richard Morris Buck, who wrote Cosmic Consciousness in 1901, said that this new faculty of man would indeed be cosmic consciousness. But could you give us just a little background on your Kundalini experience and how this sent you into a different realm, and your discovery of Gopi Krishna briefly?
Yes. Well, I would say, first of all, it was that 3 years of the dark night of the soul that I feel like that was like creating a blank image in myself. And right in the middle of that, I was meditating one day, and I felt this or I heard this crackling and this snapping, and it sounded like milk being poured on Rice Krispies, this crackling at the base of my spine. I had no idea what was happening. And all of a sudden, this energy, or I would call it a force, shot up my spine and into my head. There were all these lights going off. And it was like I had gone from 0 wattage to 50,000 watts immediately. And I was like a live wire. And again, it didn't really scare me, but simultaneous. So it was felt this real heat sensation, and there was a simultaneous thing that was going on. I also felt this suction effect coming from down below, like my reproductive area, like a vacuum cleaner, and it was sucking something up into my head. And all I know is it felt like a milk-like substance, and it was in a sense cooling me down. So I had this heat going from this energy, which was lighted, so I call it luminous. And then I had this other thing where I literally, Matt, had to put my tongue hold it on my teeth because I was afraid of swallowing it. The suction was so intense. And I was like, whatever's happening, I have no idea what this is. It didn't scare me, but it's something that, really it absolutely changed my life. So that was my immediate awakening. After it happened, it was felt like I had been burned up from within, and I got real tired all the time. I was hard concentrating. This went on for some time. It's like this energy never stopped. It's never stopped. It's like I have this 50,000 watts electric current going on inside of me. At the same time, this suction of this, and what it took me 3 years before I found out what it was, and that's when I found Gopi Krishna. But up to that point, I didn't know what it was. But whatever it was, this process was happening. And so before I met Gopi Krishna, right after the Kundalini awakened, I started having psychic and paranormal experiences. And they were really new to me, and they just absolutely blew my mind. It was like saying, you're being introduced to something beyond normal physics or science. And I won't go into all of them. I just had for years these psychic and paranormal experience. I would dream something, and then it would happen in real life. And if that had happened once, I would have just left it alone. But it just kept happening, and it blew my mind because I would write the dream down, and then sometime later it would happen in the physical world. So, and then I started having these out-of-body experiences where, it was like my consciousness was separated from my body. I started seeing spirits, kind of like Casper the Ghost, floating up out of people. I saw people as in my own consciousness. And so those were one set of experiences. I started having spiritual visions. I saw, and let me tell you before I go into more, I didn't take any of this seriously other than these experiences there was some symbolic meaning to them, okay? So when I had an experience of seeing Mother Mary on a cliff in Hawaii, filling the whole cliff, I knew it was coming from inside of me, and all it meant was you kind of have a divine calling, and Mother Mary represents mercy and purity, and then Jesus flew into my heart, and one time in a flame, and then there was another one with Mother Teresa after she died. I was hiking in Muir Woods outside of San Francisco, and I heard this voice say, I worked on saving individuals, but we need to change our human systems and institutions to save more people. So I had a lot of those experiences, and I had an experience where I was just above the moon one time, and later found out in the Apollo 11 movie that that's the picture I saw. And that just said to me, was showing me, kind of space and had disappeared. Another time I was back in the Civil War era, and I was walking in the city of Richmond after it had been destroyed, and I just, this inner voice, and I felt the sorrow and anguish of the people. It said, there was a division back then, now we have a division in our human psyche. So there were all these experiences that I didn't take. They were kind of guiding me. They said there's something else going on, but I just stayed grounded. And so it was 3 years later then. I'm sorry, it takes a little while to get to this, but partly what I'm trying to do, Matt, is I'm saying the way I came to Gopi Krishna was a lot of my experiences lined up with his theory. I always like to speak from not so much my intellect, but what I call my experience. What experiences I had, how did that lead, how did it sync up with Gopi Krishna? And also, what are my knowing? Not necessarily my intellectual, but that knowing inside of you where you have an inspiration, there's a deep truth to it. And so Christmas Eve in 1999, 3 years later, I was in a bookstore. It was before we celebrated Christmas. I had a little time, and I got led to, I went into the bookstore, and it was like I would be led from book to book. I read hundreds of books, and probably you can relate. I'm sure a lot of our audience can relate to that too. I'd be led from book to book to book. And anyways, I got led to a book called Living with Kundalini, the autobiography of Gopi Krishna. And I was like, oh my God, Gopi Krishna name didn't resonate with me because I wasn't on an Eastern path. I knew a little bit about the Eastern, but also the word Kundalini sounded weird to me. And anyways, I honored it. I picked the book up. I literally read it in about 3 days. It was like 380 pages. I thought, oh my God, this man has described everything that's been happening to me. The psychic paranormal experiences, a little bit of mental instability with the anxiety. Like when this happened to me, my awakening, it was like my vision got widened and I would look out upon the world as if I was at a height. And it was almost like I was seeing in 3 dimensions. And so whenever I drove, like I was living in DC at the time, Washington, DC, it was like I had to stay very far away from cars because I saw this broad thing and, this broad view, map of the world. And I thought, this is all so weird. But in his book, he would talk about things like that. And so it was like all these, things that happened to me. And he was the first one. I mean, psychology, philosophy, medical science, religion, nothing could explain, but he did. And so then that led me to finding out, I found his, what he considered to be his spiritual son. It was a man named Gene Kiefer, who was up in Connecticut. He just passed away, but he was kind of like, I think he started the Kundalini Research Foundation, and I tracked him down somehow and became very good friends with him. This was 1999, and Gopi Krishna had died in 1984, so he was gone. And Gene gave me 18 or 20 books of Gopi Krishna and told me all about him, and he had all his letters. He had edited some of his books. And so that led to reading all of his books, 3, 4, 5 times. And the thing, and I'll just say, and I'll let you speak. I don't mean to be dominating this, Matt.
No, you're fine.
Okay. So it just told me that, in reading, I aligned with his experience. I aligned with the concept of Kundalini. And I liked the fact that he was a very, very humble man. I could tell from his reading. He didn't want a following. He just said, I'm putting this out there for science to prove. I think this can be proven that we're biologically, there's a mechanism of Kundalini, which is biological in nature, that's leading to a further evolution of the brain and bringing in a new picture of the universe and a direct contact with a greater source. And I loved it because he had the biology involved. It was like, okay, having, I would always get divinities within, but now it was like biology, because having a finance background, I oftentimes was analytical, and it was like, prove it to me. So this was, I thought, oh my God, maybe this can be proven. And so that really turned me on, but also, so it was almost like that he was different from the traditional people that spoke about Kundalini because he brought in the brain. And he would always say, everybody's got a million views on this, okay? But when you anchor it in the brain in an evolutionary process, and he said, let's do experiments on the brain, I think it can be proven. Well, in his biography in the last 20 pages, he talked about So a lot of people don't get the biology and the evolution of the brain stuff. Okay, they might be in just traditional, whether it's, the Bhagavad Gita, which all those books I completely respect. But, he kind of tried to put it in the language of science. But in the last 20 pages of his book, in his autobiography, he also talked about the implications for humanity. I got it on that level too. And I was like, I agree with what he's saying. And just the last thing I'll say on this is he just said that because we're living the wrong way and have actually been for centuries, he said, that we're much too materialistic. We don't realize the true goal of evolution, which is to free our souls from the tumors of our body. And that there's this greater prize, but we're kind of choking on materialism. And the brain, in a sense, is revolting and is, in some ways, begins to degenerate, and every civilization that's ever risen in the past has fallen, and it's because they don't make the jump to a much more spiritual thing, and that's what's happening again. I thought, God, that makes total sense to me, and my life is a microcosm of that. And so I'll breathe for a minute.
Well, that's very interesting. At what point, and just name the year, when did you discover Walter Russell?
Okay, so one of the things is again, I speak to my experiences. I won't go into, I have a tremendous amount of details that people could go to the Buddha at the gas pump interview. But what I try to show both in my book and on that interview and the Buddha and the gas pump was that there was a biological process going on inside of me since 1997 that's never stopped. The biological process, and I'll get to your question, but the biological process had to do with this energy never stopping. But along with that, there were, physical thing like these reproductive essences, this suction up to my head. That was very biological to me, but also I had my whole system was charged up, like my metabolism was speeded up, my digestive system, my elimination, my respiration. So there was all this physical stuff going on inside of me. And then I could also see the energy, but I think that was more I was seeing on another level to be able to see the energy. And so that, like I said, that process has gone on the whole time. In parallel with, there was a certain sequence of, and this is what I was trying to bring out that I think is really important, was that I could tell you the change in my psychology or my psychic experiences. So they kind of started with anxiety. And then in the early 90s, I just started having these one-off minor experiences where I saw this bright light one time. I felt like I was on the road to Damascus and St. Paul, and you saw this bright light. And then I had one other day where this incredible presence and peace I felt, and my mind started thinking in different ways. It was like I had all these new ideas, and I started writing about, this is in 1992, that, consciousness, you're meant to have a role in trying to bring a new consciousness to people. And I said, oh my God, if anybody heard me say that, they would think I was grandiose or nuts. And because I did have an inner guidance from what I call God back in the early 90s. And then I got very enamored with Gandhi and the idea of truth and humility and character. I knew that was an important part of it. So there were early things, then it turned into, they got more when I had the awakening in 1997, the more forceful one, the psychic and paranormal experiences, which again, blew my mind, but they were alerting me to that there's a lot more into your mind and your brain than you realize. And then over time, those experiences became much deeper. And if we have time, I could go through a couple of those to exhibit, but they were different from psychic and paranormal experiences. They were more what I call consciousness experiences. And, an ecstasy, a joy inside of me. So there's just a number of those. And eventually what it did is it morphed into where I started seeing consciousness more as the reality behind the universe and the material universe. And let me try to explain that really quickly. And then that leads into the Walter Russell. But I started, it was like the material world, it was like I was living in two worlds. One was this world of intelligence or consciousness, and the other one was the normal world. But obviously the normal world is what normally the physical world would dominate me. But over time, over the years, it started becoming where it was almost like when I looked out at the material world, it was like they were images on this ocean of consciousness. That's the only way I can say it. And this consciousness was loving, it was alive, it was incredibly beautiful. And then I began to understand that, I really am just a drop from that. And then so when I picked up, somehow I got introduced to Walter Russell. I think that was around 2012. And it was like when I read about it, where he said, this is a mind motion total universe of, compressed light waves. I thought, I got the book Secret of Light, and I had a hard time understanding the science behind it. But what I did understand is kind of like what he was talking about with it being.
What year was that?
I think it was
Secret of Light.
2012.
Okay, so you're quite more familiar with Gopi Krishna for many, a decade at least, and then you got into discovering Walter Russell.
Yeah.
So you had a good amount of time to absorb Gopi Krishna's ideologies and idealisms and his work, especially on the wanting to prove the scientific end of it. So yeah, that's what I want to do, kind of give a base for the listeners as to how you came to Gopi Krishna and then eventually Walter Russell. Because what we're going to do here is juxtapose the two great minds and kind of see where their comparisons and contrasts lie.
Would love to do that. Yeah, it was years later, but when I read about Walter Russell and this universe, I thought that really aligns with my experiences. I don't really understand the science of it, but I understand what he's talking about. And then there was so much more to what he wrote about that I just resonated with. But my immediate reaction was, he has the science for this next faculty of the mind. And see, I look at it a little differently in that I see it like humankind, I do believe in evolution, but I believe there's an intelligence behind the evolution. And we've gone from, being instinct animals to intellectual human beings who think on reason. And now we've built this civilization that has poetry, music, architecture, language, but we're also kind of in trouble right now. There's some things going really wrong in society. And I think it's because this new faculty of the mind, illumination, is starting to come in, and we don't realize that yet. And so I thought, for whatever reason, Walter Russell has the science for this new faculty of the mind. And that's where I really resonated with him. So that he, Gopi Krishna, in a way, was looking for the science, and I thought maybe he has it. So, yeah.
Excellent. Well, that's great. Gives the audience a bit of a background. I wanted to do at least the first half hour sort of biographical background, Scott, and then this next hour and a half, I'd really love to dig into this paper and this pamphlet or our packet, I will say, which I will again post underneath the video a link to the Matt Presti post on mattpresti.com/posts. It'll have the notes and show research material. So just visit that, folks, if you want to get a copy of this. And so basically, and we've had many discussions. We've met in person a few times, and it's great to have gotten to meet you. I know you came through Missouri and met Henry Sweets of the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum prior to your stopping and visiting me in Salem, Missouri here. Because it was interesting. I was just up to visit Henry Sweets and get some information on museum curation and how to fundraise. And so, it was a striking parallel, but there's always reasons for things in the background. But one thing you did mention about the senses, and I think that we have to look at too, there's always the case of are we in a state of devolution versus evolution? And the way a Russell might put it is that, in times of tribulation, when great art is lessened and you see it less and less, and the architecture becomes drab and dreary and commonplace and just like cookie cutter, like the strip mall is the perfect example of a decline in architectural power. Compare it to any one of the 400 cathedrals of Europe, and you'll quickly see absolute devolution in how mind and matter relate to each other. So many researchers are on the bent that, yeah, we're in a state of devolution, and where the senses will, to an illuminate, and you could say this is a demarcation line in a person's own personal journey. When you go from trying to please the senses to the mind demanding that the senses please the mind, that's sort of your demarcation line between gross base consciousness, more of the instinctual animal, the lower level of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for instance, from just survival mindedness to, that creativeness, intelligence, where as opposed to serving senses serve, or the mind serving the senses serve the mind. And I think that's a lot of people, they come to this point where they flip. And it may be that you get intimate, little intimacies of this change in perception early on, in your teens, in your 20s, 30s. But typically, as a Richard Morris Buck would write, it happens to people between the age of 30 and 50 in most instances of his pointing out the 40 plus examples of cosmic consciousness and the years of the life of those people who that would occur in. And it was always around 33, interestingly enough. And I just want to share a slide with you. This is Carl Jung, a quote: "When you succeed in awakening the Kundalini so that it starts to move out of its mere potentiality, you necessarily start a world which is totally different from our world. It is the world of eternity." And what's very cool about that is not many people know that Carl Jung even knew anything about Kundalini. So I thought that was a good quote to just put in there to give sort of a Western nod to the idea of it as a physiological experience as much as, cosmic consciousness is a mental and spiritual experience. But to get into this, I think we can probably start out with...
Mike, Matt, can I make one quick comment?
Sure.
I don't mean to, if you've got a stream of thought going there, but
No, go ahead.
First of all, the way I met you was so flukish to me because I was driving to Wisconsin. The only reason I stopped in Hannibal, Missouri is because our family had some way back connection to Mark Twain. So I was stopping in the museum, and for years I had been looking for this model of a sculpture that Walter Russell was going to do, and it was on 28 figures of Mark Twain's books. And so when I was in that museum, and I wasn't looking for it. It was like, oh my God, here it is. That model was there. And so when I went up to the administrator, I said, could you tell me more about this? And they said, well, no, they called up the curator, Henry Sweet. So I go up and see him afterwards, and he says, oh my God, Matt Presti from the University of Science and Philosophy came a week or two or three before and gave us the book from Walter Russell, The Man Who Tapped the Secrets of the Universe. And then the next thing I know, he's on the phone dialing you. And I thought, my God, I guess I meant to meet him, and I hadn't known about it. So that was one thing. The other thing I was going to say, and I think Walter Russell and Leo, maybe it was Leo, they talked about, you can gauge the amount of love in the world by the amount of armaments, or the lack of love in the world by the amount of armaments, present. And look at what we have now. And I would also say by the music, like you were talking about, do you feel love in the music or do you feel anger? And again, that's not to judge anything, because I think this is going to lead to change, but it gets back to the devolution that you're talking about. And anyway. So.
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting, this slide real quick, just to throw at the importance of 33 in that age where even the Christ himself was said to be anointed on the 33rd birthday. His ministry was begun, is you have the 33 vertebrae in the spine. And so it's as if the year of your life and the spine and the vertebrae, and of course you've got the serpent, the double-headed serpent, the twin serpent, or the twin flames. You hear these terms and things like that, and they all relate to this in a sense. And there's a whole bunch of different, references in alchemy as well as other ancient sources to this idea of Kundalini. So I think it's going to be a fascinating discussion on these two minds and what they brought to the tables of the world for people to share. And cosmic consciousness is really an incredible topic. I know you had studied Robert May's Cosmic Consciousness Revisited. Could you just, for my own pleasure, give me a short synopsis on that book, and how did it add to the work of Dr. Richard Morris Buck? And would you recommend people read it?
Well, the funny thing about that is I skimmed just part of the book, okay? But I got to the very beginning of it, and he was the one that said in the beginning of the book, he said that, Dr. Buck was from 1901 in his book, Cosmic Consciousness, a study in the evolution of the human mind. He said, Buck was literally 100 years ahead of his time. And it's like psychology didn't take the hint and go further with it. That's what he wrote in the book and studied that more. And he said that it was beyond Jung, it was beyond Freud, beyond Jung, and that part of it really. So I actually contacted him, and we made a connection on Christmas Eve, and I don't know what year it was, and I got to know him, and he had written all these other books too, and he had had a cosmic conscious experience. But sometimes I just get one overriding theme from a book, and that overriding theme was, I think that Gopi Krishna had the next step beyond Buck. I don't mean better or anything like that. I think what that book was brilliant that Buck wrote, but that he identified the biology behind the further evolution of the brain and what goes on in the body. That means it should be able to be, the biology should be able to be proven by science. So I thought that was immensely important. So that was like the main thing I took from that. One other thing, just to back up, in 1998, when I created Soul Quest, I don't mean to divert from where you're going, but this is kind of mirroring how I made a decision that I had created a new business, and I called it Soul Quest, SOLQUEST. And I would call businesses, I was coaching, consulting, and connecting, and counseling. So that was what I was going to do. But really, it was Quest for SOL, solutions, I would say, to business people. But it really meant for me Quest for SOL, or the divine flame within, or SOUL, quest to find my soul, or the soul purpose, SOLE became. So in 1998, I ended up, I didn't have really any money at that time, and the wealth I had all got blown away. I had these investments, and they almost went to zero. And so, which again, the dark night of the soul cleared the path for me. Then I had the Kundalini awakening. It was like my mind was now clear, and I got catapulted into this new world, in 1998 onward. And I said, wherever I designed what my ideal work day would be, okay, here's what I would love to be doing. And then I turned it all over to God. I said, I turn my work life and my daily life, and wherever you lead me, I'm going to serve, and I'm going to love, and I'm going to give. And I know this sounds crazy in a material world, and I'm going to trust. And I heard this voice, basically say, you will be fine, and you will go to new places spiritually, but also eventually you'll come back materially, which again, I'm not going to get into this at that time, but it was about 23 years later before the material side of it came back. So out of that experience, then I started living a much more simple life, a slower, purer life, I would say, trying. I failed a lot, and I got rid of almost everything I owned. And at the time, my ex-wife was director of public liaison for one of the presidents, and we were divorced, but really good friends. And here I was, didn't have money or food, and sometimes, and then I made God my employer, and I said, okay, help me to serve. And at that time, this is the last thing I'll say on it, was that I likened it to, I was now climbing a spiritual mountain, but without my usual security ropes, which were income and wealth, and also relying on my intellect, ego, and self-will. Now it was all inner voice led. And then I was living a much different lifestyle, slower. And I just kind of got led to do this. And I'll just say, for about 23 years on the financial side, I thought I must be nuts, because God isn't very generous on the financial side, very generous on the spiritual side. But, over those 23 years, something would come in to keep me going on this path. So that was kind of like when I read about Walter Russell, and he talked about the idea of a life triumphant, that you really try to make your life about serving and loving, but of course you've got to make your living too. But that was the life I live, and that's what really led me much deeper into the spiritual path. And that was another connection to Walter Russell, and I did apply a lot of, and I will get into the Walter Russell stuff, but a lot of things I learned from him and Lao, to make love and try to do love in everything I do. One idea would flow after the other. I won't get into that now, but I'll just leave it there. Matt, I can't hear you.
I had you muted, so I had myself muted, which I do from time to time. You'll certainly live a better life if you love what you do, and one of my favorite sayings of Leo was, there's no task beneath a thoroughbred. That means scrubbing the floor or washing the windows or whatever. But Scott, I really want to go into this comparison because we got a lot to talk about here. And while I've got you for the next hour and 20 minutes, it'd be great to just talk about some of the notes that you put together here. But in particular, one that I wanted to touch on is, let's start off with Gopi Krishna had cosmic conscious experiences. And I know you have as well, I have as well, and many people that we probably know mutually have as well. Mm-hmm. And they may only be 5 seconds long, 15 seconds. Sometimes it could be in days or even weeks for some people. And I've talked to many on the phone during my tenure as president of the USP. Hours we would talk with all kinds of different people who said it's so refreshing to be able to have a place I can call and talk to somebody about this experience, because my whole family thinks I'm insane or crazy. And so, yeah, we are fringe explorers, you could say. And we're, again, when you start to go past that demarcation line of mind, you could say mind behind matter versus over or under, or vice versa. But when matter becomes secondary and mind becomes causal in your life, that's when you, as you said, gain the spiritual reins, and the material, as opposed, it's the mind. And this is the beauty of alchemy in the union of opposites. What you're unifying is it's not the transmutation of lead into gold that you seek in alchemy. It's the union of the opposites within yourself, which is the material world and the mind, basically. And that's Descartesian, because Descartes is the first to bring that conundrum into philosophy and separate the mind from matter. Then you have pantheism, which says God and matter are the same thing, basically that all matter is God, which Russell sort of had that viewpoint in his Universal One, but later changed it to show that matter is an effect of mind, which is its cause. And that's more in line with Fichte's idealism that started the German idealist movement. But with that said, I think when you get over that line, that demarcation, and you have these experiences throughout your life, or between the age of 30 and 50, as a Buck would point out, that you have to ask yourself, what is the purpose of material? And material is actually divine in and of itself, if it's used correctly. So I like to say, don't let wealth be your objective. Let it be the side effect of right thinking. And so that makes a wealthy person. And just to begin this, I think I'd love to just hear what was Gopi Krishna's experiences of illumination. And again, we'll be brief, and I'll roll through some of, in comparison, Walter Russell's illumination experiences. And you could touch on what was his first, maybe, and most major as well.
Yeah, well, his first one, he had it at age 34. And he was a poor student and he failed his college exam. So at age 17, he started meditating 3 to 4 hours a day. So 17 years later, he was meditating, and all of a sudden he had this incredible experience where his consciousness began to move out of his body, and it just kept expanding and expanding, and his actual ego, or his body, kind of receded more and more into the background. And in this experience was this incredible joy and love and expansion and no pain. And so that went on, I don't know how long, I think it was maybe an hour or two. And then all of a sudden he came back and his consciousness came back into his body. And then it was almost like the next 12 years, he had, he had some really tough experiences. At age 46, I would say that's when his consciousness began to stabilize in that state of mind I just talked about. So like joy, ecstasy, love, expansion. It's almost like, his consciousness or his soul is everywhere. And, but along with that, he was also meant to bring new knowledge to the human race, I think. So, ultimately, one of the things he said was, I wouldn't probably have even brought up what happened to me, but for the fact that it brought new knowledge to me, and that's the purpose, one of the main purposes of being illuminated. So like, let's say like a Christ or a Buddha or Muhammad, Nanak, they all brought, incredible knowledge to the race. So, and I always looked at Gopi Krishna and Walter Russell as almost like, and I say this, they would say with a lot of humility, but they were in some ways, they were prophets, but they also were scientists in their own way. So that to me was almost like not a step better. I'm not comparing them to Christ or anything like that, but they had this unusual combination of science and prophethood, I would say, and they saw into the future. And so they both came with a warning to the human race. I know Walter Russell was 40s and 50s in the 1940s, 50s, and Gopi Krishna was more of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. That isn't exactly right, but they both said very similarly that they're heading in the wrong direction, the race is. And I think back then it was a lot better than it is now. Now, don't get me wrong, there's been a lot of great developments too with technology, and there's a lot of good stuff too. But so I think both of them, in a sense, saw into the future, and that new knowledge is what's called revelation. And revelation is very, very rare. And people in the cosmic conscious state rarely are in that state where they're bringing revelation or new knowledge to the race. And so in a way, I think Walter Russell had a new science, and I think Gopi Krishna had the evolution of the brain and identified the mechanism, and that he said that basically there's a divine destination, which is the cosmic conscious state of mind. So we're going to grow into cosmic consciousness, just like we grow from, a baby into an adult on the physical level. We're going to grow into this cosmic conscious mind, but we're not even close there yet, but we're getting, people, some early arrivals at the port, and so, and again, I know Walter Russell in his 39-day illumination that he wrote all those books, which became, maybe you're going to get into this, but the foundation for University of Science and Philosophy. And Gopi Krishna wrote between 1967 and 1984, he wrote like 18 to 20 books. I'm not sure the exact number, but every book of his, I think, like Walter Russell's, is such a gift to humanity. But for some reason, maybe like you, the way you could understand Walter Russell, I could understand Gopi Krishna like he was like eating candy. I just got it. And I thought, how? I'm not really intellectual, or I just got what he was talking about. And every book he wrote books that, I mean, they just absolutely predicted what's happening today, shape of events. He'd write books that were like 100 page, or maybe like, 115 pages that were all in rhyme, but had all this incredible knowledge. People don't really know about him and Walter. The more and more are starting to, but anyways, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so his first illumination at the age of 34. Again, you're in that Overton window, or the let's call it the Buckian window. Yeah, it's with Russell, of course, his started around the age of 7 was his first one. In his own writings, he said he would have one every year around his birthday, and he'd wander off into the woods for days in ecstasy, which is again that feeling of divine love, oneness, with and really a heart opening. And Buck listed about 11 side effects basically that come out of this experience, and it's similar for a lot of people. But the loss of the fear of death, the utter absence of the feelings of guilt, sin, or shame. You really, it's connecting really to the mind universe, which is behind the motion universe and the cause of it. So that's an interesting thing that I think is brought about by this experience for people. And with Russell, his major illumination would happen every 7 years. So 714, when he had the near death from black diphtheria and was pronounced dead, and then popped back up, sat up, and found his parents weeping over his deceased body, and the looks in their face of absolute terror. This little kid should be dead. His throat's black as a case knife, but the doctors were still there. They look at his throat, and it's pink. It's returned to absolute health, which is a whole nother topic we could get into about the health effects of illumination and projection of previous health into the now present body, which is the the mechanism with which it heals in such a way. So then at 21, and of course up to the age of 49, he had a 39-day illumination where he compiled hundreds of charts and drawings, as well as 39,000 words that would become the message of the Divine Iliad, which was the basis of the new science, as well as he was commanded not to release it until 1946. And that was his Divine Iliad that he would release then, as well as The Secret of Light, which was excerpts of his Divine Iliad along with scientific explanations, which is the first book I encountered. And now with Gopi's approach, was Gopi, how was his work scientific in comparison to, say, Walter Russell, who had actual charts and drawings, being an artist? What are some of the similarities that you could point out? And we'll talk about some of the differences, perhaps.
Well, he never accomplished his scientific objectives. He thought that this biological process could be proven, and he said that, he called it cosmic prana, that was the intelligence that operated in the body, but it actually operated through a biological individual prana. And he said, like what happens when you have an awakening is, he said, the nerves of the whole body. Normally evolution works in a very slow manner. 10,000 years ago, we were cavemen and women, and now we have a society today. Okay, but that's a long time period. He said with Kundalini awakening, that in one lifetime you can get into this higher state of consciousness. And he said what happens is that instead of a limited number of nerves, now the whole body, all the nerves in the body start producing this, I think he called it this nectar, that the nerve endings end up creating this nectar that, and then it goes into two forms. One is a radiation or a luminous energy that goes to the head, and the other is this grosser form, which I was describing, where the reproductive system becomes also an evolutionary system. So these reproductive essences get sent up to the brain, because what happens is a chamber, and this is where he said there's a specific area in the brain that's pretty wide that opens up, and it needs to be fed by a more powerful energy. So that gets sent up to the brain, and it needs to be fed, and then eventually that's what can lead to a higher perception. But he said, it's kind of on a continuum. He said it might go to a certain part of the brain, and you might have more talent, you might have more creativity, or it might be more full and you have psychic paranormal experiences, or it may even be more full than that and you have a genius mind like an Einstein, or You can have an illuminated mind, which can have all of those things. And the illuminated mind, meaning genius. And he said, so the area of the brain, now again, he said, so let's prove this. He said, I'm absolutely positive it can be proven because it's a biological. That was my experience. So when I'm bringing myself to the conversation, I'm trying to show how when he said all these things, and even I had my first initial experiences at 35 and the more bigger experiences at 40, like it was kind of check, check, check. Mine's a very diminution part or very, smaller part. But he said, okay, so there were two main groups, and there's probably more, and this is where I don't know a lot of what's going on now on the research end, but the Kundalini Research Foundation, which was my mentor, Gene Kiefer, and then the Institute of Consciousness Research, which is a bunch of Canadians who've been.
We'll link up to their site underneath for sure.
Yeah. So he said, let's get research. He said, first thing, do a documentary study. So this was his, if you go back, you'll see that this process of Kundalini, even its biological aspects were discussed in, India, China, and Japan. He says, you start with the documentary research, it's just things in India, you'll see part of the problem is it's in, he always called it twilight language. So there's a translation to understand what he was saying. So he said, do a documentary search. Then they did all the Institute of Consciousness Research did all these, they wrote papers on the geniuses, but ultimately he said he'd wanted to run an experiment where, maybe if you could get 100 people and you get scientists and spiritual people and let them work for years in some kind of a very good setting to see by doing the right, disciplines and eating healthy and all of that, whether Kundalini can arise in somebody and prove this, because he said it's just so obvious. So, but he never could really get it going because then he died. And I think there's another group called the Emerging Sciences Foundation, who I know of, but I don't know much about. So my part of it was like, because I've had a lot of these experiences, I'm for the first time getting out and speaking. And it's not about me, but it's about pointing to Gopi Krishna. And ultimately, it's like, if they could run Gopi Krishna always said, experiments on the brain will prove what I'm saying. One, the biology behind this whole process. But he said, secondly, though, if you're a scientist or a scholar or whoever you are, you have to go into the laboratory of your own experiences and prove the different states of mind. Like it's something you can't understand through intellect, but you actually, so the research never really has gotten going. But I have a friend, Duncan Carroll, who has been working on a film where he interviewed a lot of different spiritual people and university people and behind the biology. So he's trying to put a documentary on this out there. And I've always thought, ultimately, I wish they could do a movie like A Beautiful Mind 2, some kind of where he could reach a mass audience. So.
Right. Well, that's fascinating to me. One of the things that we had talked about, at least in the paper here, and I might be jumping around in this document a little bit, but was what is the experience of the person in terms of a color spectrum? Now, I'll cite some of Walter's story personally, but you see the chakra wheel in a lot of Eastern modalities, Eastern mysticism, that kind of the color spectrum, of course, is reflected in the chakras. And so how does Kundalini relate to that chakra system? And so while I'm finding the story of Walter's illumining, maybe you could just answer for the audience. Did Gopi report in any of his experiences the effects of color, and what were those effects, and how did he describe them in his illuminating?
Yeah, well, I think the main point he was making, he was very much against the idea of the drug experience, even though I know a lot of people have had awakenings through drugs and all of that, and it's changed them, brought up new worlds to them. But he basically said that the state that he reached is, and I think, Matt, we talked about this a little bit, a lot of times on the way to that state, you have visions and different experiences of auditory voices telling you things to do. But he said, in the end, those aren't really real. They can be leading you to insights and that sort of thing. But he said the ultimate state of cosmic consciousness It's more like this peace, this paradise, these beautiful colors. He never just, I don't know what the colors were, um, and soft colors. There's no riot of colors. It's just like this peaceful paradise. And again, some of my experiences have paralleled that, and even my route to that. So that's why I know what he's saying. It's kind of like you end up in this incredible inner state, but at the same time, you're still in the world operating, and you have to be. This world's real, and so you just have this. So I know for me, Matt, and I never got an answer on this, but I had an experience where I would see these waves of colors, but they were like when I looked at the colors at the Russell Museum, those were darker. Mine were lighter, like beautiful light blue and yellow. And I didn't really know what those were, to be honest with you. And then I had experiences couple experiences where the whole world just kind of melted away in this blaze of light. And so I've been, I don't know. I think of sometimes I see the Starry Night picture of Van Gogh, and I think, God, I think he's painting the creation of worlds, or maybe, the sun, both. It's like the one I saw, suns being spit out of creation. So I can't tell you that I know that much about the specific colors he said, but he was very adamant about it. And he was so grounded as a person. There was he said, if I wanted to put out stories and sell millions of books, I could have, but I wanted this to be proven by science. And so adamant on the ultimate state it leads to is just this incredible paradise that on the inside he lived. And we've had discussions too, and he did get shown other worlds, but and he said there's just incredible number of worlds, but he said, in a sense, don't focus on that now because we're just trying to get to the next world, which is this cosmic conscious state. And a lot of people, when they have these experiences, it's easy to get carried away and think you're a messenger of God or whatever. But what
savior complexes.
Yeah, he always said, stay grounded, do all the hard work. Just like if you want to be good at anything, sports or business, you do all the fundamentals.
You got to go to the woodshed.
Yeah, that's everything. Or you have to build a chicken coop and clear land like you've done.
Right. Yep. Yeah, it's fantastic. I really like hearing that he dissuaged people from, doing the substance route, because my own research has shown that and this is a whole nother topic we could go into, but basically substances aren't to be trusted. And I don't say that lightly, but let's just say that this whole world of demons and angels, and which later, psychologists like Jung looked at more as archetypal rather than actual physical entities, which is what I think has a lot of the New Age movement bogged down in this substance cult worship of entities, which, is very Gnostic. And it's the three major religions basically stem from this Gnostic view that the world is fallen and we need to escape out of it in order to experience heaven, that heaven's not here, and so I really don't like that message. I never have. It's like, heaven and hell are here, and it's really your mindset that makes it one or the other. And if you're a gross materialist whose, mind is enslaved to his own senses, then that's going to be your experience of the world. It's going to be hell. It's going to be war. It's going to be, I want that guy's land. It's going to be the doctrine of might over right and destruction and more for me and less for the world. And I want, when you already have all the money and you own the printing presses that print the money, it's not enough. At that point, you want control of people. And that's where the term, power corrupts absolutely, comes from. It's a complete disregard of anything other than the path of materialism, which is the hedonistic view and the living of life through the senses for the acquisition of the senses alone. And then you have the diametrically opposed view, which is that, all of us are awakened in some experience or another to have this feeling like, materialism isn't everything. That's not all there is. There's this thing in me that wants to be happy, but And anytime I make easy choices, I never end up happy. But it's the hard choices that might take 10 years, 15 years to be fulfilled that end up making one a happy person in the end. And I think that's what, Leo Russell, bless her soul, she said, somebody asked her, what's the difference between regular people and an illuminate? She said, it's very simple. Illuminates can see farther down the road. That's it. But they're still human beings.
Yeah.
They're not to be worshipped. That's why I really like the Russell philosophy in a lot of ways. And people like Gopi who say that, substance isn't the way, because in a sense, substance becomes an idol. And what are you going to say? You can't reach God without the idol? All substance is idolatry in the end. And it's you and your mind in the sober experience, which is what Buck wrote in regard to that all the 40 cases he studied were all sober. So go figure that. How come the greatest ones of all, the Blakes and the Shakespeare's and others who were divinely gifted, the Christ, the Buddha, they had these experiences in a sobriety-like state. It was, you're intoxicated by the light itself, which is the ultimate ecstasy, So I just found that interesting. But to quickly go to the what Russell saw in his
point on that.
Sure.
Matt, I know there's a lot to get to, but just to give you an example, like Gene Kiefer, who I said Gopi Krishna considered him his spiritual son, and he worked with Gopi for 50 years. He moved out from Iowa. He was like a journalist, and because he somehow had a dream about Gopi Krishna, so he moved out to Connecticut, and he did a lot of work. And he was a brilliant man, Gene Kiefer. He wrote a book called The Secret Teachings, and like I said, he was an editor of many of Gopi Krishna's books. One of the things Gopi said to him, Gene said, and so he was a brilliant man, but Gene said, do I have any chance of getting illuminated? And Gopi Krishna, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't know if I got this exactly right,
Sure.
But it's close. He said, well, it's like a 60-year-old man trying to become an Olympic athlete. And in other words, like, what he was trying to convey, that it's a process, it's a biological process. And let's say we are evolving to be some semblance of God, or the characters, the virtues of God. So is it going to be an easy thing? Think about what it takes to be good at anything. Spirituality is even harder. So that's what Gopi, he was like. So when people met with him, they would say, like, he was just, he'd slam his hand on the table, and he was just down to earth and just right to the core of what needed to be done. There was no splash, but it was basically, there's just a lot of really, really hard work. Unless some people are born illuminated, I think eventually we'll be birthing illuminated people, just like we be, birthed self-conscious people. But that's far away. And the other thing he always talks about, brain evolution is speeded up, because brain evolution, whether through meditation or concentration, that's what speeds up the evolution of the brain. He said, what's happening now is, with all the technology and the materiality, if you look at people, they're always on their phones, they're always they're always thinking, but in a way, they're not thinking of the most healthy things. You follow me? Like, in other words,
and they're not truly listening either.
Yeah, but they're creating, kind of in some ways toxic brains, because, they're getting lopsided in their development. So he just said that, in a way, we almost have to live the opposite of what we're living. As you get closer, deeper into spirituality, that's why if you looked at Buddha and Christ, and none of them had any money or education,
Right.
or Thoreau was out in the woods, or Walden Pond, or whoever, so anyway, I just wanted to make that point.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because Julian James's consciousness, the bicameral mind, he talks of the gods in the head, the voices in the head, and how they've begun to disappear, over the past 2 millennia. And now that's what caused the external worship of God. And now you have AI coming in to be implanted in your brain to become the new conscience for man. It will be an algorithmic conscience that's artificial. And I'm a big promoter of natural intelligence, NI, versus AI. And I kind of see that as the game that we're playing here. But I'm all for NI.
Did you see the movie Oppenheimer?
Not
about,
yet.
oh, okay. I was
Yeah,
just
not
going to
yet.
say, because in that movie, even back then, Oppenheimer said, we don't have the consciousness to handle the nuclear bomb. In other words, they wanted to then build a hydrogen bomb. Well, I look at it even now that, we can't even control the nuclear, anything could ignite a nuclear war right now. But now you
Right.
throw AI in, and where that could go, if we were more ethical as a society, okay. But I'm a little bit nervous about it. Like just what you said, it's
Yeah.
kind of like rather than going inside and developing a connection to the ultimate intelligence in the
Yeah.
universe, we're now relying. So,
And prior to the Terminator, people worshipped Skynet. They thought it was great until they started mass producing Terminators. So, yeah, well, and they burned the sky, as the movie said. So then with Walter Russell, I want to get into the comparison of the Kundalini experience to Walter. And this might be a clue that, because he never described in any of his writings, none of the writings I saw in the archives, any kind of a biological feeling necessarily. The way he put it was that he became one with, the divine light, you could say, and he felt as if his body was attached through golden flux threads of light. And he could see these golden flux threads of light attaching everything else to everything else. And that's how he knew light didn't travel, that it was instantly informed of any change, even the slightest change on the whole other side of the universe would inform the bodies of all other quadrants in the universe so that they could effectively keep the balance, and not one weight, not one bit of balance, the weight of even one electron would be out of place. So that was a divine way that he put it. But when he went through his experience, I was just looking at this, and I'm pondering this because I'm looking as well at chakra photos, right? And you could say, just follow along with me here, but
yeah.
this is Walter Russell's words of his major illumination in 1921. He says, "Then it happened, a blind glare, red, then incandescent, then a field of blue, shut the whole world of all things out from me, leaving naught but indescribable ecstasy, while my body wandered by itself without me to the great root of my beloved oak tree, where I found myself sitting with a handful of marbles." So that's basically, he says red, which is at the base of the chakras, and then he says incandescent, which would be the central, the heart, or the solar plexus, sorry. And then the blue, or the violet, which is up in the throat and up in the top of the head. So I'm not wondering if maybe there isn't some relation, but what would you say to that? The chakra system, the twin serpents that wrap around the spine, the 33 in the spine, of course. These are all sacred things, and there's so many things you could say about when the Kundalini rises and takes its place in the skull. Between the hemispheres unite and they become one, and then that's the electric short circuit between the two lobes of the brain, which is how the Russells defined illumination, was an electric short circuit between the lobes of the brain that catapulted one into the experience of this still magnetic light behind all motion.
Yeah, I know, like, I feel like at certain times prophets come for a certain reason. So you had, all the prophets came at a certain, well, actually over, Buddha 2,500 years ago, and then Christ, Muhammad, but I feel like, then you had Gopi Krishna, Walter Russell, and he had something to contribute. And then I feel like, Gopi Krishna came maybe a little bit after, even though a lot of it, they were at the same time. But he got into the physiology. So one of the things he said is, like, it's like the brain center opened up first, and that created this need for the energy to go up and feed it. And so he would define the chakras as really nerve centers, a cluster of nerves. So he put it in physiology terms. And he said, that one, this luminous energy, but also this grosser or Dabarita thing going substance, that they actually, will feed the nerve centers, because that's where, like, let's say one of the clusters is around digestion or around elimination or the heart, that they need a stronger energy because the body actually is getting changed to bring in to accommodate this higher consciousness. So he put a physiology behind everything. So he said, it's a cluster of nerves, and so this energy feeds that, the organs need to be tuned up to handle this higher potency of energy. And it also needs a kind of a tonic or a nutrient, which this grosser substance take care of. And he said, so that's the physiology of it. So that was, to me, had never been explained. And that's why I was so interested in, is there a connection between Walter Russell and Gopi Krishna? The other thing I was going to say, Matt, is he was probably born, like a lot of people don't experience the physiology. That seems to be much more rare than all the other experiences. And for whatever reason, I had all that he talked about. So there's like not a doubt in my mind that this is biological, but it's still, I guess, maybe rare. But I honestly think if you did some type of questionnaire, people would come out of the woodwork right and left and be able to, so Walter might have been born into some area where he was almost cosmic. I know he had experiences, but he almost had from birth, maybe he was a genius or close to one or close to CC that he wouldn't have felt the physiology. Okay, so because maybe that wasn't his purpose, and maybe that allowed him to do his purpose more. And then Gopi Krishna came in to fill this, because what the Gopi Krishna stuff may do is he always said, I think I quoted you, that he said, this has to be proven by the objective methods of science, the biology. That's not going to consciousness change. Maybe someday we'll be able to somehow measure changes in consciousness, but right now we're not there. And he always talked about at the brain level, he said, where mind meets the neurons. He said, he said, not only did this more Kundalini energy, this more powerful energy, feed the brain, but he also said there were subtle changes at the level of the brain where the neurons again meet mind, and so there's actually additional brain material added on. And one other thing he said,
and power voltage. Walter called that voltage.
Yeah,
he said illuminates had more voltage in their brains.
Yeah, you have a powerful energy, but on the other hand, think about a computer. You've got whatever it's called. I don't know much about computers, but whatever.
More processing.
Yeah, the brain thing and the is bigger.
More RPM.
Yeah.
More RAM, right?
Yeah, right. There you go. So.
Yep, that's fascinating. To me, the connection here, I think, is an important one, but the chakra system and Kundalini itself, if you think of it from this level, and we could take ourselves as an example, we were both in our 20s, right? Mm-hmm. and any young man in his 20s is going to be more on the hedonistic side of things. At least my friend circles were, we were hitting the bars. We were having a blast, living like there was no tomorrow. We all thought we were going to die in our 30s, We had no concern for retirement or anything, and it was just sort of a wild man lifestyle. And, we all go through that. I think most of us guys do, sort of a rite of passage. But in the West, and with, as you said, the degradation of art and other things that, gives us more time to screw around with this kind of lifestyle. You could almost say that with Kundalini and the chakra system, and this is what I've always thought too, and I might have heard it in interviews in the past. I've literally listened to thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of interviews over the past couple decades plus that I've been researching alternative information and energy and health and body and all that good stuff. And one of the things I think is very correlative is that the chakra system, if you look at it from like, where does your consciousness dwell? And you look at prana, you look at the sex urge, as Walter called it, the life force, or the ode, as Karl von Reichenbach would call it, or the Wilhelm Reich's term, which was the orgone. It's that vitalism, that force of vitalism, and it's rooted basically in the root chakra. That's where it wants to go up. It definitely wants to go up. And sometimes there's been talk that's when it's unleashed suddenly. It could be through a traumatic experience. It could be through some really incredible sunset you're witnessing, but that energy suddenly shoots to the top of your head. But my interesting correlation and concept here that I come to, and I think about a lot, my reference to us being in our 20s is maybe consciousness is sort of rooted to Kundalini in a sense that if your Kundalini only gets to your sacral, which is your second chakra, which are the sex organs, then that's how you're going to look out at the world, right? Isn't it interesting? So over the years, you might get up into the third section, which is, your solar plexus and such, and then into your heart if you have a heart opening in your 40s maybe. But how many people's consciousness actually gets up into the crown? And so that's where I would say the illuminates, if to borrow that term, the folks like a Russell or a Gopi Krishna or a Walt Whitman or a Blake, would get to these places. And, that's definitely directly related to the work that they do, the writings that they write down. You can see it. And I don't think it's easy to recognize until you've at least tasted or have had that experience at one time. I have had 11 what I call mini illuminations. One lasted 3 days. It was all the same things that I would read later in Richard Murray Spuck's work, his 11 basic checklist for how you would know that you had that experience. I checked all of those. I'm like, wow, incredible, but it was only a short thing. But I did notice that there was a heart opening that was not there prior to that, and that's one of the things I think when you go back and you read books again that you read prior to an experience like this, suddenly you're like, wait a second, how'd I miss this the first time I read it? And I think that your understanding grows. So would you say that Kundalini, the chakra system and consciousness, is it actually able, and from Gopi's descriptions maybe, does consciousness reside lower in the spine if that force of vitalism is blocked off or regressive? And a lot, when I said regressive earlier, meaning there's people in this world, on this planet, we call them the deep state or the elite, that simply want to control humanity and do these terrible things to the rest of us. As Tolstoy said, government is a group of men that want to do violence to the rest of us. We are on the verge of this war. Are their consciousnesses regressed or stuck? Is their Kundalini handicapped and stuck in a lower part of the spine?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on this by any means. I know the way he talked about it was the idea that just the normal prana in a body is what's allowed us to go, again, over 10,000 years from cavemen. So it's a very slow process. Mm-hmm. When Kundalini fires up, then that more powerful prana goes and works on the brain. And so if you haven't had an awakening, let's say, of the more powerful prana, and it's just residing still down at the spine area or at the base of the spine or maybe somewhere in between, then I think you would be stuck in that kind of a consciousness. And I would say now it's hard because what people are, the way they're living with, think of our kids. Maybe back when we were growing up, there was a lot of ethical development. At least there was in my family. There was a religious stuff, a little excess, but there was still, the principles, maybe the actual institutional religions. But now it's like I look at it, everybody's on steroids, whether it's on technology or, it's like the kids, they've got these active brains, but there's no kind of a slower, peaceful, development. So I think it's almost like a lot of people that more powerful energy, or if it does get risen, it's more toxic these days. Their body isn't ready for it. And so then it to me, that's what mutates into mental illness, ADHD, rather than like during Christ and Buddha time, it was a much slower rural lifestyle, much more conducive to the awakening of Kundalini. And, now it's kind of like people have thrown out, religion but it's kind of like Gopi would always say, you just needed to prune the tree, like
Right,
that.
right.
And that to me, that's where I honestly think like the 12 steps were what changed my life. Like they were I was raised Catholic, and my parents always, taught to live an ethical life. And of course I didn't all the time. But when I found the 12 steps, it was kind of like I found, what, you come to your own meaning of God, and it isn't mediated to you. There's no hierarchy. And so that program, and also though, because maybe we've become very impure because of all the materialism. I'm not against materialism at all, too. If you're living a balanced, sober life, okay. But it's kind of like, I think the purification work that needs to be done is more, and in order to reach higher power, the surrender is more. And the 12-step Al-Anon program facilitated that for me. So it was an absolute indispensable program. And before that, I had done 5 years of spiritual direction work and all this work on myself, like you, I'm sure, counseling. But so that's kind of a longer answer. I'll say one other thing, Matt. Like I found my experiences were a little bit different I didn't have the big the big flash of light. I had a mini flash of light, but I feel like I went through what I did. Like you said you had 11 mini awakenings. I think I was having mini awakenings. So mine was more a gradual process. Okay. But I really got emphasized to me. Then I had the bigger awakening in 1997, but a lot of people have had bigger awakenings than what I had, but I got taught it's the ongoing process. If you have that powerful energy flowing in you, then it's the long-term process that matters, and your consciousness continue to grow and grow and grow to this higher state, but in a much more safe way, if you're following me. And so I put it all on the line, not that I knew what I was doing, and I was able to do this because my ex-wife was making a lot of money. And so I learned, to put it all into this spiritual work. So I worked feverishly on spirituality, just hours a day. And I kind of proved to me. So anyway, so like the ongoing awakening was process was more important than the initials were important. I don't know if that's making sense to you, but that's kind of how I look at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was trying to stir out maybe if there's a relation between, because in the chakra system, there's nerve ganglia in the spine that line up right accordingly with the, the 7 chakras.
Yep,
So there's
yep.
no lie in the chakra model. It's perfectly aligned with the nerve ganglion of the spine, the centers, and I'm just curious how maybe if Gopi had anything to say about that consciousness could reside, say, or get stuck in the 3rd chakra, where it's more or less looking down back toward the animal as opposed to up toward heaven. And I wonder if that with alchemy isn't where the marriage of opposites has to occur, because again, there's a demarcation line between people who live outwardly toward their senses and then those who have these intricate or very intimate, subtle awakenings that there's something more, that there's this idea of the mental universe versus just a material universe. And that's a very thin line. And at what point do you cross it? It's kind of like the north and south of a magnet. Where's the fulcrum? It's in there, but it's so thin, and you can cut the magnet in half and you still have a north and south, and you can cut it in half, each of those halves in half, and you still have a north and south with a new demarcation line. So that line is very thin, and the point at which you go from leading a life based on the collection of material things to please the senses, you go from using the senses basically to please the mind and as tools of the mind. It's not a separate thing. It's one and the same. But so I was just curious if Gopi had written anything on, does consciousness get stuck in these lower arenas? And But obviously, Walter would say too that with consciousness, and as man awakens to it, and this is an interesting tidbit to note, that he was very impatient with God in 1931, 10 years after his major illumination, in 1921, of course, where he wrote his Divine Iliad. And he wrote this letter basically chastising God for, I've done everything you told me. Science threw my book in the trash can. And I'm paraphrasing. I'm not, it was a divine writing, divinely inspired, is 10 years after his major illumination, of course, and around the same period of time, June 18th through the 23rd. And he had written two 10-page documents that I've got and have reviewed. And the first 10 pages was him shaking his fist at God, kind of like, I've done everything you told me. Man has rejected the message. He doesn't care. You said it would be, a divine delivery to man. And then God in the second half kind of answers back and says, look, son, you're extremely impatient. You are but the heralder of the first 50 years of a 3,000-year-long process. And I'll just say this, I had a whole ton of weight on my shoulders prior to reading that, because I thought, man, I've got to get all this done. I've got to set up this museum. I've got to get this message back out to the world. This is my charge to inform the whole human race, to try to help, to try to assist. And when I read that, it was just like, we can only do what we can do here. This is a process. And I think for a lot of us, we want to see things just, click overnight, and you wake up and everybody's awake and aware, and the powers that never were take a back seat and everything's great. But it doesn't happen like that. This, again, I think it's important just to realize and remember that, we do have a spiritual side to our existence. We have a mental side, and we have a physical side. And it's the balance of all three. The Japanese call that the triangle of life in Shintoism. Evelyn Underhill, who wrote the book Mysticism, a wonderful little read back in 1910, her quote that I just love is, mysticism is the art of union with reality, not getting away from reality. So, and then you have James Horn, who wrote Mysticism and Vocation, who, they're both short books, and I recommend them to people. Horn is basically summing up how, there's a social morality, and then there's a special morality for these types of saints and individuals that, break the mold, if you will, and perplex psychologists and others. There's no guidebook on how to study these people. There's no psychological breakdown or profile that adequately explains the experiences that these people have, like a Gopi Krishna or a Walter Russell, for instance. And for us to try to analyze or look at this with terms that we're familiar with only degrades this experience. So when you have it yourself, and it is something to strive for, I think it's something to live, with the knowledge that it's possible. Even if you don't have it, I say there's two times in your life you'll definitely have it, whether you like it or not, and that's at the moment of birth and the moment of death. But if you're fortunate enough, and again, the practical side of a Walter Russell, for instance, would be that we can experience this when we feel moments of inspiration. And the very word itself is inviting you in spirit. Inspiration, be in the spirit. And when you're in that spirit, if you follow that feeling, if you follow it, and don't let the commercials, don't let your phone go off and ruin, don't go buy a ticket to Coney Island instead, as Walter Russell would say, but actually follow and immerse yourself in the feeling of inspiration. That's when at least 9 out of the 11 experiences that I had came to me. I was writing music, I was mixing it down, and just the incredible sounds, and it all came through, and all that inspiration just welled up in me. And I'd literally a couple different times fall to my knees in tears with the ecstasy of this divine, light experience within me. And I think we should do well to remember again that this is a process, and it's not going to happen overnight. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm laughing because I know I wrote to you about the idea that I know Walter Russell, when he came out with his book, Universal One, and he sent, what was it, like 700 letters to scholars and scientists, and I don't, maybe,
He sent the Universal One. 1,000 copies were printed. 300 were mailed to prominent universities, and the other 700 copies of that book were sent to prominent scientists around the world.
and how many did he hear from?
Very few.
I'm laughing because that was Gopi Krishna in his book, The Biological Basis of Religion and Genius, which the foreword to that book was written by a German scientist, von Weizsäcker, who actually was friends with Heisenberg. And so he had the guts to write the foreword to that book because he said,
Nice.
Gopi Krishna is the real deal. But Gopi didn't get any responses, or very few, if any at all. And I think he was probably frustrated at first. I remember him in one of his books, I think it was Wonder of the Brain thing. The fact that people aren't talking more about this cosmic conscious state of mind is just a travesty. I could feel the frustration in him, kind of like, but I think over the years, and he kind of just mellowed into an acceptance. And I know from my own experiences, it was like, I remember giving God the finger at times, like, Jesus, I'm doing everything, and it's
Right.
just getting harder. But what I came to see over time, I was always being led to something more and more. So that's, again, I always try to relate I can relate to their bigger experiences on mine, mini experiences of the front, like nothing works on your timetable. But I've learned over time that everything works out in a better way, but in the short run, it's really hard. And from 1998 on, I would say, I looked at it like this, Matt. I didn't have hardly any money, and I did, all these business deals I was working on. I said, you could be a criminal and you would get 1 out of 100 done. I said, I couldn't get any of them done. But, in a sense, this intelligence knew better because it made me surrender more and more and more. I always survived. So in a way, if I had gotten this earlier, I wouldn't have got to the development of my soul that I got in terms of the depth of my surrender, the ability to live on less and less, and which are all facilitating my spirituality. I just wanted to read you something really quick that Gopi Krishna wrote on enlightenment. It's a very short thing. And he said, here's how he described the cosmic conscious or enlightened mind. He said, what we see with our 5 physical senses in one dimension of consciousness, the world is real, and so are the vicissitudes of life that fall to one's lot. In the next dimension, the world of opposite disappears. Consciousness, the world of opposites disappears like a melting ghost, yielding place to one all-pervading ocean of blissful consciousness, in which embodied life, pain, decay, and death disappear, like the figments of a dream from which one has just awakened. In the wakeful state, the soul finds itself wafted to a new eternal world of being, where all is sunshine and happiness, that knows no pain, no decay, and no death. And then one other thing he wrote, I wanted to read this because this is where, again, he kept saying that, mind has an independent existence of its own and exists in a universe of its own. And he said that we don't live in the world lives in us. In other words, we're projecting out through our mind, through the layers of the brain, a picture of the universe. So there's not an outside world, really. And then the other thing he said, it's the upgrading mechanism, Kundalini, the upgrading mechanism for the brain, because we often hear we only use a small percentage of our brain, and how do we use a greater percentage? And so he always would say that's what Kundalini allows us to do. And so I get back to your chakra thing. I don't remember him saying consciousness was in other parts of the body, but I think like it's very close to what he was saying. I mean, I could be interpreting this wrong. I just look at it, if somebody just has a normal prana running, they're not going to have any, but let's say they have they got some more vital prana running, but they're living a wrong lifestyle and everything. That might manifest itself in some of the things you're talking about, like being stunted in their spiritual growth or having more problems. But I don't know if it does make sense to me, the idea if the energy is at a certain location, maybe, like they always say, if it gets up to the head, your forehead, then intellectually you become more at the heart level, your heart opens. I don't
Right.
know, it might have some truth, but
Well, it's been, it's basically the question, if Kundalini stops, does consciousness stop? And I did a presentation for homecoming for the University of Science and Philosophy this past September or October, early October, and it was on the scientific explanation of sex by Walter Russell. And an interesting quote regarding the sex urge from both the Russells was this quote: the misuse of the sex urge is the cause of all human suffering, unquote. And so that was just, to me, like, when you look at vitalism, and the whole of vitalism is that there's this urge and that urge is what is, you could say, a scientific definition of electricity, which is the division of an equilibrium into a polarized condition that then seeks to reunite to replicate or repeat its unified condition once more to just again divide. And that's what we call sequences of time or reversals of motion, like night and day and night, and such, so on and so forth, breathing in, breathing out. One polarizes, one depolarizes. And that's what's so beautiful about the Russell work, I think, too, is that it's really rooted in nature. And Gopi had plenty of excellent quotes, and one I'd like to read here. We can discuss it briefly, where he talks about the real aim of yoga and religion, spirituality, is to open the door to the unused potential of the human brain, and that the religious spiritual experience and the disciplines advocated for it signify the operation of a budding faculty in the human brain over and above the intellect, designed by nature to extend the experiential area of human perception to include what is beyond our knowledge at present, the province of the mind and soul. Any thoughts on that?
well, the first thing is I was feverishly looking for just that right now as you, but my head was
Page
out.
6, brother.
I've got my, pages all messed up now, so everything is,
Right.
Another thing he said is, and that's to me exactly what he's saying. I'll back up a little bit. He said, mind or your soul has an independent existence, and so I don't know how to explain this other than one of the things that, let me just read you something I wrote, that my own experience that speaks to what Gopi said. I wrote, when I look upon the world, it appears more transparent now, soft, alluring, embracing. The outer world seems to be more a projection of my own consciousness and not a separate universe apart from me. The physical world has lost its dimension, substance, and separateness. I relate this to watching a movie in the theater. You see moving images on the screen that seem to have a dimension, separateness, substance, and sound, but are really only a projection of light through film images onto a screen accompanied by sound. In my case, it's now as if I see myself as both my mind or my soul, let's call it. It can be the same thing, which is projecting out a picture of the universe through the liaison of the brain onto the screen of space. And yet simultaneously, I see myself as a physical being or actor in the play of life. The difference is now that I see my real self as my mind, which is a drop of this radiant, light, joyous consciousness, which has a permanent existence, as opposed to thinking of a frail, mortal body, which will live and die. And so that's one of the things I do experience, and that's what Gopi Krishna talked about, is that, it's like the purpose of life, is the self-awareness of the soul to know its own divinity, but he brought in all the brain, which I found fascinating, because he said it really depends on the capacity of the brain to show you this next state of consciousness. And when you begin to see that, you see, like he described, this beautiful, it's the same world, but it's just brighter and more peaceful and radiant. And so what you're seeing, he always said, is a portion of your soul, really. And that's the ultimate purpose of life. But most of us aren't there, or close to getting there. So that isn't necessarily relevant to them. But I was saying that because I feel like brain evolution is so speeded up, which, if people could understand there's this incredible goal for us that they're closer to it if they could change, if kids knew from an early age. And I just want to read one other thing on that because it has to do with this concept. And I always said we need triathletes. If I were a youth today, it's kind of like, where are you spending all your energy? Like I did. Okay, maybe you do like I did. I was sports and drinking and that kind of stuff. But the idea is if you understood the target to where we're moving and you started early and you have a more advanced brain, you could, people need to be aware of this cosmic conscious state of mind that I think it's more realistic that people can come closer to reaching that now. And so I said, we have a lot of people I were around, they would run triathlons, which are great things, right?
Mm-hmm.
Swim, they would run and swim and run. And what's the other one? Bicycle. Well, become a triathlete in body, mind, heart, and soul practices, which was the work of Michael Murphy at Esalen, an integrated set of practices, and start those early, and almost like you're an astronaut trying to then reach this new state of mind. But here's the last thing I wanted to read, and I just think it's so moving to me because I see our kids, even the way they're acting out now, because they're partly acting out because they know the world, not that they know this, but the world's askew, and so they're being led into these maybe, causes or some of it not good, But here's what Gopi wrote. He said, "It's speaking of the possibilities of a higher state of consciousness positively influencing our youth," he said. "The children on whom our future depends will be alive to this truth from an early age." He's talking about the chance of reaching cosmic consciousness. "The result can be electrifying. There's no influence and method of upbringing that can act so well in inculcating the desire for an ideal life in the plastic minds of children as the idea of a romantic adventure needing courage, devotion, honesty, truth, love, compassion, patience, and perseverance, all of which the object is entry into a golden world of eternal life." So
Beautiful.
yeah, I just feel for our youth sometimes because I just feel like, where is all that energy going right now? And he also talked about, and again, this gets to, honestly, too much education or intellectual work can actually act as a hindrance too in the development of this higher thing because your brain almost like short circuits, so that's like, think about the elite universities. And I feel in some ways, maybe it was, I wasn't, concentrated that well in school, but maybe that was good because if you're just intellectually developing yourself, it can be, again, a strain on the brain.
Right. I think the goal of a lot of these guys, and it's well said, Scott, the mystics, if you will, or the illuminates among us, they always point us to a better place. But I think the ones that really stand out, and one of the reasons I have respect for Gopi is that he didn't divorce the body from the process. And in so many religious traditions, you go to a place, you're fed these words, these beliefs, these systems, these routines that you're meant to do. And so often it's just a spiritual practice, but there's nothing associating the body to it. It's sort of divorced from the body. So with a Russell or Gopi who identifies the spiritual process physiologically, what Russell would in contrast, in comparison, he'd say that art is the use of the body in the correct way, producing fine art, if you will, music, poetry, sculpting, architecture, just these different modalities that one uses the body and must use the body to express that divine inherent nature that is within all of us. And that's where Gopi and him really would be, in agreement that it's, don't divorce the body from the process. Kind of like somatic intelligence. A lot of people, especially in the New Age movement, they like to divorce the entire body from the process, as if, again, being in this world, in this material world is an evil in and of itself and a prison that we need to escape. And I think that's, for me, what I get the best message from the illuminate, from the mystic, is that this world is not a prison. It's a divine creation. And if you can cross the Rubicon from materiality, lived through the senses because you're a slave to them, into the world of mind, which uses the body as a tool to express its own divinity, to crystallize its own thoughts into the forms of your imaginings. That's the proper use. That's when heaven on earth is achievable. That's when the demarcation line is crossed and you fuse the opposites of the world that Descartes left us with two choices versus a Russell or a Gopi who says it's one world, and you can make it whatever you want, a heaven or a hell. And your consciousness can go toward the animal, toward the lower natures, the lower chakras. You could keep your Kundalini bottled up in the root, or you could pull the cap off through some spiritual practices and the practice of great art and following your inspiration, and move yourself and your entire awareness into a higher field of vision, if you will. But you don't have to leave the world to do that. You don't have to go to the 5th dimension or the 12th dimension or the 34th or 9,000th dimension. You can do that right here through various different modalities and spiritual practices that involve the body in the process, and I think that's where, that's what I would term practical spirituality. And I think it should, I'll just say this, it's up to people to decide if they want to integrate a spiritual practice into their life. But if you do, just be careful that you don't leave the body behind in the process.
It's interesting that you say that, Matt, because one of the messages I got from the very beginning of my journey was, it's really important that you're just a regular person, okay? And actually, the Buddha at the gas pump, it's called ordinary people having spiritual awakening. So it's more about, so my thing was, Scott, you don't need to go to an ashram. Nothing matter with that. You don't have to live in a monastery. I want you out in the real world living. You're going to have to alter your lifestyle, okay, if you want this bigger prize. But you can, we're meant to generate enlightened people through the regular living of their lives, just maybe more information on how to live or the incredible importance of living a more pure life, because what Gopi would say, where, Mike Bradford wrote the book Consciousness, the New Paradigm, he would say, eventually he thinks they're going to be able to show how when you, like religious injunctions, not religion, but, spiritual ideal, call them secular ethics, like the Dalai Lama, that there are biological reasons for that. And if he even said Gopi Krishna, the spiritual impulse is actually in the genetics of us. And so if you are not living the right way or practicing the right principles, they're going to lead a negative effect, biological impact on your body. And it's going to manifest in mental illness or behavior. So it's almost like, I don't know if people really understand, because we're becoming so advanced, like this spiritual disciplines, whichever, and honestly, I think there needs to be a lot of research on what are the best ones, and everybody's got to find their own path. I understand that. But a lot of people, I don't say anything, people have to find their own way, but I just think they're just wasting so much time, and maybe they need to do that. There's got to be a lot of research on, hey, is it true that we're evolving to the cosmic conscious state of mind? If it's true, let's do a lot of research on what are the best practices to help people to get there. Because I just want to read one other thing, Matt, and it has to do with the gifts.
Sure.
Okay. Because I just found this, and I have actually found this to be true in my own life. So people, like, one of the things, I never had a clue on the gifts of spirituality. Yes, the cosmic conscious state of mind, that's a great thing, but there's all these intermediate steps, which again, Gopi Krishna talking to the idea of the brain evolving in the correct way, or, it's enlarging our capacity to experience greater things. So it was like, so it can result in so here's what can happen. It can result in an expanded awareness and a magnificent state of being, graced with maybe just new talents, which are wonderful, greater creativity and perception of truth, stronger intuition and inspiration, psychic gifts, and in the real extreme case, genius, cosmic consciousness. You can lose your fear of death, become certain of eternal life. You can have greater longevity, better health, a stronger intellect, more vitality, peace, joy, beauty, harmony, love, a higher moral elevation, stronger connection to people in all of life. And so even the way to this next state of mind, people can experience some of those gifts more. And he always wrote, the gifts of this next state of mind will greatly exceed the current prize treasures of human life. But it doesn't mean that somebody says, well, I'll never get to sight, cosmic consciousness, so it's not relevant to me. No, that these leads to these other spiritual gifts, which I have found to be true for myself. So the thing I loved about Gopi, and the thing I think you always have said, we don't have to believe in God, we can know God. Well, I mean, in the 12 steps is like this. They say, if you do these certain things, here's what's going to happen to you. But you don't have to take it on faith or belief, see if it happens. And that's how I, view this path. If they're working and these things are happening to you. So. Matt.
I knew I was going to do that again one more time in the show, but yeah, that's great. I think it's wonderful. There's a lot of promise that can come from, studying the giants whose shoulders we stand on. As I like to say, the point of that is not to worship the giants, but to become giants ourselves, so that we can pass on our player's manual, our books, to those people that come behind us and inspire them, to be the best version of themselves that they can be. And as we wind this down, Scott, I know we barely scratched the surface on this, so we may have to have you back. In fact, it'd be good to have you back at some point in the months of next year sometime, and we can do a more thorough discussion and run maybe a part 2 on this. But for this particular episode, we've covered a lot, and we've got a good start. You can't even do justice to either Gopi Krishna or Walter Russell in an hour and a half, much less. You could do 12, 15, 18 hours, and you still wouldn't even scratch the surface on the lives of great men like this. So really do owe them another episode, and I'm certain we'll have it. You did ask one question on page 19, Matt, how are you going to prove God in a laboratory? And I wrote, ha, 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 next to that question. But that's a great question. We already have, actually, and I'd love to get more into that, but I'm limited on what I can say. But I will say that things are wonderfully progressing, moving along, and there'll be announcements in the future, just not at the present time. But I do want to say to all the listeners and everybody, this has been a really incredible year. It's been a hell of a year for a lot of people. 2023 is a year that will live in infamy. We've seen more truth come to light than I think we have in the previous 20 years, all within 1 year's time. We've seen a lot of change, a lot of reclamation of people's free speech, which were thrown into the garbage can from 2020 to 2022. There's so many good things happening despite all the bad that seemingly is happening as well. So don't forget to look to the bright side of things, folks. And also know this, that, you can do anything you put your mind to. And I think that's what these greats, they try to give us that. And Scott, I do want to give you a chance just to give any, I like to say, give any of your personal links and your closing statements, and I will scroll your books as you're doing that. So people, all the links will be below this video where you can hook up with Scott and order his books if you'd like to look more into his work and get some inspiration from this gentleman. So why don't you just give us your closing thoughts, and like I said, we'll have to do this again, and then any contact information where people can reach out to you.
Well, the first thing I was going to say as you were talking is I feel like Gopi Krishna and Walter Russell and the knowledge they brought can really catapult us into the new world that we're called to. That's number one. Number two is, I'm sorry if I've talked over you at times. It's like the problem is every time you talk, Matt, 5 ideas come into my mind. It's so exciting. It's almost like I had to put a seatbelt on myself because normally I can't talk.
That's the nature of a podcast, my friend. If this is only your third one, you'll notice it'll wane eventually. But
Yeah, I could have talked for 5 hours, and it was fascinating, and you
Indeed.
generated so many ideas in me and so many thoughts. So it's been wonderful, and the best way to reach me is I don't have a website. I'm going to get one, but is like through my email or Facebook. So I don't know if I should give you that, Matt, or.
I can run your email if you want me to. If you guys want to reach out to Scott, that's his email. Write it down. I'm sure he'd be happy to communicate with you.
Sure, and
And then also, why don't we share the ICR Canada too? Just
yeah.
guys can check that site out.
Yeah, definitely check this site out. It's icrcanada.org. So ICR, then the word Canada, no spaces, .org. And I'd also look up emerging sciences. I think it's emergingsciences.org. I'm not as connected to the person his name is Mike Molina, but I think he's doing some interesting research, but I haven't really been able to talk to him lately. So, and I would also highly recommend Gopi Krishna's autobiography, Living with Kundalini, and Mike Bradford's book, Consciousness, the New Paradigm.
Excellent. All right. Well, Scott, thanks. I appreciate you coming on. I want to say happy solstice to the TEC family and to you and all those in the world who are going to celebrate the solstice today and the start of the new year, which is actually, I celebrate that today as well. So it's been a pleasure to have you on, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come on, and let's do this again.
I'd love to do it again. Thank you for the 2 hours, and thank you to your, I was going to say better half, but to your really nice half and beautiful half, Lori. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it to come out that way.
No worries. She is in many ways my better half, so that makes sense.
I really kind of meant that would have been for me a comment for myself, but she's a beautiful person, and thanks for all that you do.
Appreciate you, Scott. All right,
Okay.
listeners, send a donation if you can. We appreciate you, and we'll catch you on the flip side of next year. Enjoy your day. Happy solstice. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for viewing and for sharing the link to this TEC podcast. To find out more about the work that I do, you can visit mattpresti.com. Scroll down to the bottom to view all of my social media links and channels. If you feel so inclined, you may leave a donation through the Cash App by scanning the QR code or using the hashtag $MPRESTI. To contact me, simply reach out through the contact form at mattpresti.com. Thank you so much.